More than 100 dead in a single day. The Middle East fighting climbs to new levels. Be aware, not fearful. The deadly Ebola virus not likely to reach the Western world. Refugees fleeing violence, the focus of the Pope's August prayer intentions. And we visit the native land of Pope Francis, a look at the challenges facing Argentina. Those stories and more tonight on EWTN News Nightly for Tuesday, July 29th, 2014. Good evening from Washington, D.C. Thanks for joining us. I'm Brian Patrick as we look at your news now. In 3 weeks of war, the bombardment that Israel unleashed on Gaza today is unprecedented. Meanwhile, here in Washington, Congress is debating millions of dollars in new aid to Israel. Our Jason Calvi is on Capitol Hill tonight. Jason?
Brian, Congress is looking at $225 million for Israel and their Iron Dome system. That's that system that blocks Israel from rockets and missile attacks. And while that's discussed here at Congress, over in Gaza, the death toll rises. In Gaza, more deaths, more mourning. A child no longer plays, the lifeless body now wrapped in a white sheet. Mourners carry the dead through the streets. A Palestinian health official says 100 were killed in Gaza today, and at least 1,100 since July 8th. 53 Israeli soldiers and 3 Israeli civilians have also died. Today, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry discussed the conflict and criticisms of his leadership.
This is about Israel and Israel's right to defend itself, and our strong support for Israel's right to defend itself.
Israel is not letting up on Hamas. Israeli tanks hit Gaza Strip's only power plant, shutting down power for most here. Meanwhile, the White House makes an appeal.
It is the view of the United States that is in the clear interest of people on both sides of that conflict for an immediate ceasefire to be put in place.
This aide to Palestinian President Abbas says they're ready for that.
Following consultations with our brothers in Hamas and Islamic Jihad, the Palestinian Authority declares its readiness to an immediate ceasefire and a humanitarian ceasefire for 24 hours.
But back in Gaza, a Hamas spokesman rejected the call for a ceasefire as Hamas and Israel continue trading attacks. And late word from the military leader of Hamas. He says they're not going to agree to a ceasefire until their demands are met. Brian, this is an ongoing conflict that we're continuing to monitor here in Washington and across the world.
All right, thank you. Jason Calvi on Capitol Hill tonight. Meanwhile, some of the other stories our EWTN News Nightly team has been covering in today's world. The Senate today confirming former Army Ranger and corporate CEO Robert McDonald as the new Veterans Affairs Secretary. McDonald is from Cincinnati, where he held the top job at consumer product giant Procter & Gamble. His new mission, a complete overhaul of an agency beleaguered by long waits for health care and charges that VA workers falsified records to cover up delays. McDonald was unanimously approved to replace acting VA Secretary Sloan Gibson, who took over in May after Eric Shinseki resigned. The new secretary should have a much bigger budget to work with. House and Senate negotiators have approved a compromise bill to spend about $17 billion to overhaul the Department of Veterans Affairs. The bill is intended to help veterans avoid those long waits for health care by hiring more doctors and nurses to treat them. It will also make it easier to fire executives at the VA. The bill now moves to the full House and Senate, and if passed, on to President Obama later this week. Adrian Atizado is the Assistant National Legislative Director for the Disabled American Veterans. What do you think of this compromise bill that could be approved and signed by the government later this week?
Well, we think it's a good first step. As you know, $10 billion of that 17 is actually going towards addressing access to care so that veterans can actually be seen when they need to be seen by a doctor. $5 billion is actually to buff up VA's healthcare system, and we think that $5 billion as a down payment to Sloan Gibson's request for $17.6 billion earlier in the week in the Senate. So we're looking forward to the House and Senate passing this and the President signing it to address the current crisis for access to care at VA.
Will it be enough?
Well, like we said, this is a first step. As you know, VA is under advanced appropriation funding, which means they're debating now the fiscal year 2016 budget for VA. And we fully expect the new secretary to come forward and ask for whatever resources he believes is needed to make sure VA sustains this level of effort.
So we have a new secretary. He was confirmed today, Robert McDonald. Is he the man to get this work done?
Well, we believe so. He certainly comes to the table with a lot to offer. We like the fact that he is very dedicated to veterans. We were witnessing his nomination hearing. We like what he said, and we like what he has done. So we are in support of what he is trying to do, and we would like to very much see him succeed, because if he does, he helps veterans in return.
I got to know him in Cincinnati as the CEO for B&G. Very much an Army Ranger, a graduate of West Point. So yes, he's got a job ahead of him. Adrian Atizado, thanks for joining us from the Disabled American Veterans.
Thank you.
We appreciate your service, too. Well, a defeat tonight in the in the federal appeals court panel ruled today that Mississippi law that would close the state's only abortion clinic is unconstitutional. The 2-to-1 ruling involved the state's 2012 law, which required physicians at the clinic in Jackson to obtain admitting privileges at a local hospital. Physicians at the clinic did apply for the privileges at Jackson area hospitals, but they were denied. House Republicans could vote Thursday on a slimmed-down bill to address the immigration crisis on the border. It would deploy National Guard troops and speed up the process of sending unaccompanied migrant workers back to Central America. At a cost of $659 million through the end of the fiscal year, this is a far smaller bill than the $3.7 billion request that Obama wanted. Well, could all the talk of impeaching the president have started at the White House? House Speaker John Boehner thinks so, flatly denying that impeachment has even been considered.
We have no plans to impeach the president. We have no future plans. Listen, it's all a scam started by Democrats at the White House.
Some Republicans have said Obama would open the door to impeachment if he takes steps to end deportations of immigrants in this country illegally. House Speaker Boehner says Democrats are using the impeachment rumors to rally their supporters ahead of November's midterm elections. If so, it's working. The impeachment chatter helped the Democratic Congressional Committee raise $1 million online in one day. The committee chair says the House Republicans' lawsuit against the president and these impeachment rumors are galvanizing Democratic donors. Well, the U.S. and the European Union hitting Russia with a new round of sanctions. EU officials say Russia is escalating the fighting in Ukraine while not helping in the investigation of the downed Malaysian airline plane. Wyatt Goolsby is covering that story tonight. Wyatt?
Brian, Secretary of State John Kerry says that the Russians haven't shown a shred of evidence that they're willing to help in the violence in Ukraine. Earlier today, fighting in the eastern part of the country once again prevented international investigators from getting near the plane crash site.
And also under difficult conditions on the ground. We've been trying. We've been working around the clock on securing access to the crash site, and it's our key priority.
Today, Ukrainian Foreign Minister Pavlo Klimkin joined Secretary Kerry in Washington in condemning Russia and pro-Russian separatists for fueling the violence. In the last 3 days, a 50-member team of Dutch and Australian experts have been blocked from getting to the site. As a result, the EU has a new arms embargo and a ban on the sale of some energy-related equipment. Today, President Obama weighed in on the problem.
And it doesn't have to come to this. It didn't have to come to this. It does not have to be this way. This is a choice that Russia, and President Putin in particular, has made. There continues to be a better choice, the choice of de-escalation, the choice of joining the world in a diplomatic solution to this situation.
So far, no response on the Russian side from the president or from the EU sanctions. Meanwhile, the work continues for investigators in the Ukraine and the Netherlands in identifying the bodies of the victims. Only one of the bodies has been identified. The head of the forensic team says it could take months to identify the others.
We don't just identify people from a photograph or from an item of property that may be on them, because there's been countless mistakes, examples of mistakes where that's happened in the past over the years, even in small incidents like car crashes.
Most of the passengers on that flight were Dutch citizens. Also today, the vice president said the U.S. will send $7 million in humanitarian aid to help the war-torn parts of Ukraine. Brian.
Wyatt Goolsby, thank you. And 2 Americans working in West Africa are among the hundreds of people now testing positive for the deadly Ebola virus. It's been spreading since March, and international health organizations are struggling to contain it. More than 750 confirmed cases have been reported in the last 4 months in Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia. 467 of those cases have been fatal. Doctors say Ebola spreads through direct contact, and it can be killed with soaps, detergents, and disinfection. They say Americans should be aware of the threat, but not fearful. There haven't been any cases of Ebola spreading to a developed country, mainly because of our access to clean hospitals with proper infection control. It's official. Pope Francis will visit Sri Lanka and the Philippines next year. The Vatican confirmed those dates today, January 12th through January 15th. The program hasn't been published yet, but the Vatican says it will be very soon. The Pope's August prayer intention focuses on refugees forced by violence to abandon their homes. Pope Francis is praying that they find a generous welcome and the protection of their rights, and we're asked to pray along. Christians and other minorities fleeing an Islamist onslaught in northern Iraq may now find refuge in France. The French government says it is ready to help facilitate asylum for the Iraqi refugees. Coming up, Argentina, the homeland of Pope Francis, faces tough economic times. Meanwhile, American consumer confidence appears to be on the rise. In the words of Pope Francis, may we be always more grateful for the help of domestic workers and caregivers. Theirs is a precious service, a compassionate reminder from the official Twitter feed of Pope Francis tonight. Thanks for joining us on this Tuesday. I'm Brian Patrick. No more fun and games in Pope Francis's homeland. Just a few weeks ago, Argentina made it to the World Cup final, but tonight, the nation is facing a harsh economic reality. As our Catherine Elliott reports tonight, powerful creditors want to be paid.
The flags are still flying high after the World Cup, but there's an undertone of uncertainty and fear in Buenos Aires. On the streets, people are worried about the fragile state of their economy. One mother says it's already changed her family's lifestyle.
I've changed the way I dress. I had comforts before, such as help at home, and I no longer have that. My children went to a good school, but we've had to lower their level of education and move schools.
Mercedes knows the hardest change may be yet to come, with expectations the economy will contract by 1.5% this year. The country's GDP was down in the first quarter of this year, and it's declined even further in the second quarter. Economist Daniel Artana says the government lost about $15 billion of reserves from October 2011 to today.
And the economy lost momentum. We were growing at that time. Now we are in a recession. And inflation at that time was about 25%. Now it's about 40%. So everything went wrong for the government.
This already unsustainable situation may become less sustainable still. If Argentina cannot find a way to pay its exchange bondholders by the end of the month, the country will be in default.
I try not to be afraid, but there are things that one lives through on a daily basis that make you fearful. First, the economic uncertainty, how things may turn out, and then the pressures we face over individual freedom and security. So the fears are there.
Fears that may become more difficult to escape with Argentina's soaring inflation and depleted reserves. Catherine Elliott, EWTN News Nightly.
Thanks, Catherine. And things may seem brighter in the United States, but a new study shows that many Americans are deep in debt. A new report shows that 1 in 3 Americans have debts and unpaid bills that have been reported to collection agencies. Those debts average more than $5,000. The report from the Urban Institute released today points to student loans and hospital bills as the main culprits. Mortgages, auto loans, and overdue credit card payments are also piling up. The delinquent debt seems to be concentrated in southern and western states, in New England, and here in Washington, D.C. U.S. home prices rose at the weakest pace in 15 months as home sales remain modest. Yearly price gains slowed in 18 of the 20 cities used as an index. They accelerated in Charlotte, North Carolina. They were flat in Tampa, Florida. Home sales have been restrained by weak wage gains and tight credit, especially for first-time homebuyers. But despite all this, U.S. consumers are more confident about the economy than they have been in nearly 7 years. Consumer confidence jumped to 90% in July, up from 86% in June. The July reading is the highest since October 2007. That was 2 months before the recession started. Economists cite strong job growth as the key factor in this improving outlook. A bill claimed at protecting citizens from unfair property seizure by federal agencies and law enforcement has been introduced in the House. Under current law, the IRS, the Department of Justice, even local police departments can seize property that may be linked with a crime without charging or convicting the property owner. Last year, the Federal Asset Forfeiture Fund collected more than $2 billion from these civil and criminal forfeitures. The bill introduced this week would guard against abuse of this process. We're joined tonight by Congressman Tim Walberg of Michigan, the author of this legislation, a member of the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee. Congressman, why the reform here? Is this being abused?
It is being abused. The whole idea, Brian, of the law was to make sure that criminals had assets seized to help recover costs of doing the correct law enforcement. When we got the Civil Forfeiture Act, it went beyond that and said, basically, we haven't charged you, possibly. We certainly haven't convicted you, but we're going to take your assets.
What about innocent until proven guilty?
Yeah.
That kind of turns that on its head, doesn't it?
You would think that's a normal process here in the American culture, and it has been. I mean, that's what we say we believe. That's what our judiciary system is supposed to uphold. But in the case here, it's a loophole in a law that was intended well. Henry Hyde saw it as a very important provision to make sure that we didn't go the opposite direction. Third world countries have the problem. My daughter is a missionary in Kampala, Uganda. She doesn't think of calling the police. Police aren't necessarily there to help you. They'll end up really hurting you, and there's bribes and all that goes on. In America, we have come to understand, we teach our children, you can always trust a law enforcement officer. The police are your friends, and I think they are. But this allows them, for whatever reason, to get dollars that will help some of their coffers, do good things for the police department, but in the end it ends up violating the public trust. And we want to get at that and say innocent till proven guilty is still the standard that we must have.
How do you propose to do that? What change needs to be made?
Well, we're going to tighten down the definition and the standard of proving innocence or guilt, and make sure that it is the law enforcement agency that's responsible primarily to prove the guilt of the individual, as opposed to how this has become, for instance, the Nadeco case in Michigan that really got my attention on this. A grocer, long-standing family-run business, no problems, but they would deposit on a daily basis under $10,000, but right close to that. And that was because they didn't want to leave at risk dollars that they took in from the proceeds of their business and to entice a robbery to take place.
So they were suspected of something else?
They were, and the insurance company they had would only insure up to $10,000, so they would make deposits on a daily basis. Law enforcement saw that and said, this smacks of money laundering. And so they charged them under Money Laundering Act, kind of an obscure provision in that, and it ended up taking $36,000 of their assets, and they had to defend themselves in a court. Ultimately, they were adjudicated to be innocent, but that $36,000 was taken from them, and that's not the way it should be.
Not in America, no. Isn't it kind of strange, though, that legislators would be having to oversee government agencies that might be reaching too far into the citizens' lives and pockets?
Well, in a time of diminishing dollars and budgets that have challenges, you can see why some would say, tell you what, let's not catch the drug pusher who's bringing the drugs in until after they've made the sale. Then they come out of the city with cash in their car, and we can use cash far more easily and readily than we can use cocaine. So let's let them make the deal. Well, that kind of goes against our whole system of saying, let's stop the drugs from getting to the people and do the job of law enforcement, protecting our full citizenry, as opposed to looking for the most lucrative way to still do the job, but get something that can be used for the law enforcement agency.
Take the temptation out of there. Congressman Tim Walberg, I hope you'll follow up with us. Thank you.
We'll look forward to it. Thank you.
Up next, 100 years after it began, the impact of World War I is still felt today. And there's new evidence tonight that runners live longer. On this July 29th, a Tuesday evening, thanks for joining us for EWTN News Nightly. I'm Brian Patrick, and good news tonight for runners. Newly released results of a long-term study confirm that running may actually add years to your life. Whether you plod or race, running, even for a few minutes, can reduce your risk of death from heart disease compared to those who don't run at all. That's according to a new study published this week in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology. Researchers studied some 55,000 adults between the ages of 18 and 100 over a 15-year period, noting their overall health if they ran and how long they lived. Compared to non-runners, investigators found those who ran had a 30% lower risk of death from all causes and a 45% lower risk of death from cardiovascular disease. In fact, runners on average lived 3 years longer compared to those who did not hit the pavement. When data was broken down by age, sex, body mass index, smoking, and alcohol use, the benefits were still the same. The speed at which runners ran made little difference. Researchers also found those who consistently ran over a period of 6 years or more gained the most benefit, with a 29% lower risk of death for any reason and 50% lower risk of death from heart disease or stroke. So if this gives you inspiration to start a running program, even for 5 to 10 minutes a day, health experts say talk with your doctor first. Once you get the green light, get up and go. And a game changer for college sports. The NCAA has agreed to settle a class action head injury lawsuit. Federal court records in Chicago show the NCAA will create a $70 million fund. It would be used for testing current and former college athletes for brain injuries. Players could use the results later as grounds for suing for damages. The agreement also includes policy spelling out how all teams must treat players who receive blows to the head. The settlement applies to football, hockey, soccer, basketball, wrestling, field hockey, and lacrosse. It covers both men and women. The filing Tuesday in Chicago notifies a judge that the parties have struck a deal after nearly a year of talks. A war that began 100 years ago this week may seem like just another chapter of history. But World War I changed the world beyond recognition.
It was 100 years ago, World War I, but it's still shaping the world in which we live.
It was the world's first truly global conflict with more than 30 nations involved. Much of it was captured on film. World War I was the first time armies used tanks, machine guns, submarines, and aircraft. Millions of soldiers were called up. Millions were cut down in their prime. One of them was Private Andrew Bain from Australia, killed by an exploding shell in Belgium in 1917. His descendants recently traveled to Belgium to pay their respects at his graveside.
It's nearly 100 years on, and there's so much in our family still relates back to his death.
Germany and its allies fought against Russia to the east and against France and Britain to the west. The Western Front turned into trench warfare with extremely high casualties.
They were so high because of the sheer destructive force of modern firepower, the fact that trench warfare was there to protect soldiers and created a static form of warfare that involved advances over yards and meters rather than miles.
The sheer scale of the carnage made World War I unique. 1 million dead in a single battle. By the time the guns fell silent, Russia had been taken over by the Bolsheviks and the U.S. had become a superpower. And it all started 100 years ago this week. Well, the famous Louvre Museum in Paris is used to attracting visitors from around the world, but those visitors aren't used to seeing rodents that are now filling its gardens.
I normally don't see any rats, so that's why I was surprised about it.
While the museum is aware of the problem and regularly conducts rat exterminations, the animals can be seen running freely on the grounds. Maintenance staff says the rats are attracted to picnic remains left on the lawn. A veritable smorgasbord taken from Charlotte's Web. I forget the rat's name. Well, we encourage you to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, watch again anytime on EWTN's YouTube page. For all of us here at EWTN News Nightly, I'm Brian Patrick. Thank you for watching tonight. Good night and God bless you.